Kerry Grace, co-founder of Ready Communities. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and elders past and present. And I'm coming to you from Gumbaynggirr country in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Over to you, Chad.
Awesome. Thanks, Kerry. And my name is Dr. Chad Renando. And I too want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're on. And I'm speaking to you from Yagara country up here in Ipswich.
So to get started today, we're going to be talking about ecosystems and what social impact ecosystems are looking like in regional Australia. Can you tell us first, Chad, what is an ecosystem?
Yeah, no worries, Kerry. And that term gets bandied around a lot, and a lot of people talk about it from obviously an ecological perspective and the environment. When we think about an ecosystem, first we go back and we have to think about like a system, right? And the concept of thinking about place and location as a system really came around about from the industrial age, when we started seeing how everything's working together from different industry sectors and the industrial revolution and the inputs and the outputs of things. That started coming into a bit of a concept of the nation state and how nations work together, how countries work together, kind of a global perspective. And then around the 1930s, this turn came up on thinking about it as an ecosystem and making some comparisons to ecology and biology. And then from there, we started thinking about, well, how are these things configured? What's the structure of them? And then around the 1980s, 1990s, we started thinking about things, as far as clusters, and they said things like helixes and triple helix of government and university and industry, and all that starts working together. And then around the early 2000s, we started actually configuring these and saying, well, they look like a certain thing. And we started mapping them, and we started figuring out, well, if we can kind of think of them as a concept, maybe we can measure them and measure their impact and treat them as like a construct, if you will. And then we started thinking about different types of what we call ecosystems: startup ecosystems, entrepreneur ecosystems, business ecosystems, and different variations on that, like creative industries ecosystem and a university ecosystem, the ecosystem supporting environment and climate, or a female entrepreneur ecosystem, an indigenous entrepreneur ecosystem. And so I've done a lot of mapping around these and saying, well, what do they look like? How do we communicate them? How do we get people to understand, like any sort of map, where am I? Where might I be able to go? And how do I get there? And who's going to help me get there? And so that's kind of the purpose on thinking about things as an ecosystem, on how things start working together, and what can we maybe adjust if we're going to try and help get to one place to another place better. And whatever we say as the center of that ecosystem is kind of the thing that comes before it. So, for example, the entrepreneur ecosystem is the system by which we support entrepreneurs. The creative industries ecosystem is the thing that supports creatives. And whatever we say about that actually defines what is and isn't in that ecosystem. And one of the ones that's come up recently, Kerry, is that you and I have been talking about, is the social impact ecosystem. Essentially, what is the system by which we can support things having a social impact? But that's not just, things for only, social good. It's actually economic good. And it's really kind of a holistic perspective. And Kerry, we're seeing that a little bit in obviously in the work that we're doing in Ready Maclay, on saying, well, do they have a social impact ecosystem, and what does that look like? And what are we seeing there?
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess before we have a look at what it looks like locally, why would people bother thinking about or coveting an ecosystem? What difference is it going to make?
Yeah, like that is a good question, because especially from somebody who maps ecosystems and social impact ecosystems. Well, why should we? And part of that is because it's the system by which I can get that outcome. And if that system's not working, if all the different functions aren't there, it can be what we call dysfunctional. If you don't have a certain part of it, if the government's not necessarily stepping up, or if industry is not necessarily participating, or you don't have the entrepreneur community, or you don't have the financial capital to support it, if all the different parts are there, and unless we map it, we don't necessarily know what's working and what's not. And so people can be running around saying, how come this isn't happening? Well, it's because we don't maybe have one of the functions, or the functions aren't working right. And so mapping really helps us understand what do we have to work with, what's working, what's not. And because one of the things that you and I talk about, Kerry, is, sometimes people can say, well, we don't have a social impact ecosystem here. Well, in reality, the ecosystem always exists. It's just maybe some of the parts aren't working, so you're not seeing what you need in order to get to that next step. And ultimately, if you don't have that ecosystem functioning, then maybe that thing that you want to cultivate, whether it's entrepreneurs or startups or business or social impact, that'll actually just go someplace else where they do have a thriving ecosystem. So it really is important to develop your local ecosystem for whatever it is that you want to work on, so that those particular actors, the roles, the species, if you will, in your ecosystem have a place to thrive in your community.
Thanks, Ted. So I guess if we're talking about social impact itself, it's a very popular term at the moment, very popular practice. A lot of people are talking about it. So regional communities I'm working in would like to have some of that social impact stuff happening. But to start with, the language isn't necessarily there. And I guess one of my reflections is that an ecosystem would have a language that it could, I guess people could riff on together. Is that right? Is that what an ecosystem can do?
Yeah, it gives people that common language so that they can kind of have a bit of a yarn around what is a common thing that's going to get us to the end outcome. Because otherwise, if I'm talking apples and you're talking automobiles, then it can be a bit tricky to get on the same page.
So in regional communities, there's a lot of talk about different problems, and we frame our problems and work out, who's going to solve youth homelessness or who's going to solve employment opportunities. But generally, that business of doing good is the business of the not-for-profit sector. Not-for-profits are the biggest employers, largely in regional communities, so that not-for-profit health services. So to start with, if we were to change business as usual, that would mean that a lot of people could potentially lose jobs. So flipping over to more of a social impact language could actually be threatening in these regional communities. And I see things like this actually making it difficult to grow these ecosystems in regional communities, because we're implying that business as usual isn't necessarily working. And it's not, because we wouldn't have social challenges that we have in any of our communities if it was working. And also, it means that in doing things differently, we might need to collaborate differently. And because entities are very conditioned around competitive funding sources, while we might work together and be seen to be collegial, fundamentally, we're all competing against each other for the same small amounts of funding. And I think this is one thing that's quite different in regional communities, because not only do we have the tyranny of distance, we have less people. So therefore, less entities to spread funding across, but also often less funding coming into these communities. So how can we possibly build something like a functioning ecosystem based around social impact when the phrases are new, the terminology is new, the players might find it difficult to work together, and the skills simply aren't in the region to start with? And I do have some ideas on this, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Yeah, no ways, no worries. You're absolutely right, and that's one of the things. Like when we talk about rural or regional ecosystems, communities, um, on the one hand, there's more of a need, but also it's more of an exciting opportunity because you can kind of get your head around that as an ecosystem. There's some great work that came up, where they got a bunch of leaders together around a decade ago, and they said, look, um, what are all the services that are needed to support what they call ecosystem services? And they got a whole bunch of ecologists and a bunch of biologists and a bunch of social impact and place-based workers together in a room. And they all came up with these 7 or so um, principles of ecosystem services that can really help develop these kind of things. And one of them is around that maintaining that diversity and redundancy, exactly as you say. Quite often when you go to a region, it's always the same people around the table. They all look the same way. And you don't have a lot of that backup of services. Another one is managing that connectivity, on getting those people together on a regular basis, and also getting that connectivity in and outside the region, because one of the terms we often say is you can't be what you can't see. And so making sure that you have some of that, those connections outside. And also, if I have an idea that I want to be able to take that to the next level. Also, that whole notion of encouraging experimenting and learning, because there can be this thing of, yes, we tried that thing about 10, 20 years ago, or or potentially stepping up and having other people see what you're doing, which you'll have a term for, on making sure that we can learn through that failure. The third one is broadening that participation, making sure again that we have as many people around the table as possible. Making sure that we have a governance system that isn't just top down. Quite often, when you think about who does this, they can just look to the government, or they can just look to somebody else outside, when actually it's all of us, and it's a bit of that distributed leadership that we really want to develop in the communities. Um, Making sure that everybody understands that it is complex, like there's a reason why this is a challenge. So it can seem kind of simple, straightforward, but this is a change process that we're talking about. And finally, again, it's acknowledging that long-term impact. And so how do we measure things, like, are we getting together? What are some of the connections, so that we have a bit of a longer horizon? So it's not just the short term, hey, I haven't seen anything in the last 2, 3 months, and so we're just going to give up and go back to the way it was. So following those, but then practically again, Kerry, what have you seen as far as how that actually shows up on the ground?
Yeah, so in our pilot, Ready Maclay in Kempsey, um, I've been working with a lot of community members and just having really a lot of conversations, whether it's around the coffee table at Lou's Cafe or in our consultation sessions that we've had during the activation weeks. And I notice social entrepreneurs in action in the community, but I haven't had one person come up to me and say that they are a social entrepreneur. They might identify as a not-for-profit manager, or perhaps they're a community volunteer. Even one of the local ministers in Kempsey is most certainly a social entrepreneur, and luckily for us has also had a lot of training in social impact. So to me, having met that person really gives me a clue about who might be a leader in the community in that area, who can encourage other people to come on board and to have those conversations as well. So one thing that we will be doing is starting a monthly, it will be something like a lunch and learn, something like that. So it's not about bringing experts into the community at this point to teach people about social impact and all of its practice. To start with, what we'll be doing is using the strengths of the community, but giving it language. So I'll, myself and hopefully Father Jesse will also be helping people to interpret their practice and give it, help them to understand what that language of social impact is. But as they're doing that, also connect with each other and identify collaborative opportunities for funding, and also ways that they can accelerate their work in the community. So off the back of the success of our coffee chats that we ran throughout April, I know that those lunch and learns will work quite well to bring people together, to share the language, to share the practice, and to create collaborative opportunities. And that's certainly something that can continue long after we've left the community. Also, while I mean, I think it's great to have external learning opportunities. Generally, and the way that I've had to access my social impact education is to get on a plane and fly somewhere to learn, or to do them online. Now, the plane, of course, is expensive, and it's been quite an expensive undertaking for me to do that through the last 2 decades. And it's not accessible for a lot of community members. So having somebody come into the community and to build up that rapport with community members and to teach, so that then online education has more context, is good. But we really need community members to identify their gaps first. So I know it can be tempting for governments to fly somebody in to teach everybody about this brand new thing that nobody really understands. But once we start fleshing out what the community actually knows, I believe that we'll find in this particular instance that community knows a lot more than we give them credit for. They just don't have the same language around it. And I'd rather see us invest in external learning opportunities that the community really needs, and the skills aren't here and can't be shared locally. So that's also part of it. But I think it's fair in regional communities that we need to talk about how businesses and small businesses fit into these social impact ecosystems as well. So I've noticed for many years in my not-for-profit practice, we can do as much as we like to ready somebody for the rest of their life, to get them out of the problems they're facing or whatever it is. But if there's nowhere for them to go next, what do they have to aspire to? So involving the business community in this work, I believe, is really important. And in Kempsey, it's exciting to see through our CBD activation theme, a lot of businesses get involved. But Chad, what's your observation on how community and economic development can interact in an ecosystem?
Yeah, you bet. Well, and that's kind of that was the focus of a lot of my research is when you do this kind of work, one of the things is there can be a lot of unintended consequences, and we can enable as much as inhibit or help as much as we hurt quite often. Um, and so that is one of the things when you go in, like you say, we can fly somebody in, but who does that displace locally? Or encourage people to step outside their region, but next thing you know, you have a bunch of people leaving the region because they find opportunities elsewhere. And so really it's taking that holistic view, exactly what you say quite often is that economic development, community development integrated through, which is why we aim to take a holistic view. And even though like our conference coming up in September is called Social Impact in the Regions, but we are just as much engaging with the innovation, with the entrepreneurship, with the industry, with the investment attraction, as well as some of the social impact challenges, because we acknowledge that, depending on where somebody's at in their life journey, what it takes to be a social impact entrepreneur or what we refer to as an ecosystem builder can really vary across communities and depending on where they are in their life. So we do take that holistic view. Um, and that kind of leads us to what we have coming up and how people might be involved. Obviously, people are going to be listening to this and thinking, I'm involved in economic development, I'm involved in social impact. I wouldn't mind a little bit more support, or what does that look like practically in the community? Kerry, coming up, what are some of the specific opportunities that we might have both for Ready Macleay as well as leading up to the conference in September?
So the conference will have conversations about building these regional ecosystems, 4th to the 6th of September in Kempsey, New South Wales. Just a clue on that too, if you're listening to this and it's still May or June, book your accommodation because it is going to book out in Kempsey. Also, we're going to be launching a survey, so you can see the link on the post attached to this. And what we're hoping to achieve in this survey will actually be a series of surveys. We really want to meet the people who are doing this ecosystem and social impact work across regional Australia so that we can engage them in a broad variety of ways. So quite keen to know who you are, even if you don't identify with that language of social entrepreneur or social impact. Just if you're doing good things in your community, we want to hear from you, no matter what the language. And also, we're having conversations with people about bringing Ready communities to your regional community. So reach out to us if that's something that might be of interest.
Excellent. Thanks, Kerry. I am just so looking forward to both hearing what people say on the survey, just to getting a broad view on what it's actually like on the ground in Australia, being able to feed that back into the conference, into the programming. So I definitely want to design the program around what people are experiencing. I'm just so looking forward to hanging out with the people in September. And obviously the conference is going to be for general social impact development, as well as informed by all the work we would have been doing over the last 10 months in Kempsey and the Macleay region. So yeah, it's going to be really exciting, and definitely look forward to seeing everyone there.
I agree, Chad. And I must shout out to the Kempsey people as well. It's really exciting seeing people getting excited about hosting a conference. So that, usually conferences are just plonked inside a community, but Kempsey is really getting ready to host our conference delegates. So it's exciting.
Thanks.